Hi, everybody. Welcome to class. This is just sort of a final class for me, just sort of hopefully shorter. I always say that reflections, just some personal reflections on our text, Ocean of True Eloquence from Je Tsongkhapa. And just as we sort of close off and finish this particular course, and even in a lot of ways, just a lot of our sutric study together. So just here in Hong Kong, middle of the night, it's classic jet lag thing, and hopefully it's not too. Everything's so dark outside, and I've got all the lights on here. Hopefully it's not too reflective. Um, and Yeah, so just about to head back to Vancouver soon and go back home. So it's always kind of fun recording overseas here, and I love Hong Kong so much. Yeah, so let me just get started. So it's just going to be just a few, rather than like a full class, just a few personal reflections just to kind of tie up, maybe not loose ends, or just even just sort of have a little bit of an appendices or some of my own personal conclusions that around this particular text and a lot of the content in it and stuff. So I'm just going to read the Heart Sutra just as a blessing here. Homage to perfection, wisdom, the Blessed Mother. Thus I've heard at one time the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajgir in Mass Vulture's Mountain together the great assembly of monks and nuns, great assembly of bodhisattvas. That time the Blessed One was absorbed in the concentration of countless aspects of phenomena called profound illumination. That time also Superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of the great being, was looking perfectly at the practice of profound perfection of wisdom, looking perfectly also at the five aggregates being empty of inherent existence. Then through the power of Buddha, Venerable Shariputra said to Superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of the great being, how should a son of the lineage train who wishes to engage in the practice of profound perfection of wisdom? Thus he spoke, and Superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of the great being, replied to Venerable Shariputra as follows. Shariputra, whatever son or daughter lineage wishes to engage in the practice of profound perfection wisdom should look perfectly like this. Subsequently, looking perfectly and correctly also at the five aggregates being empty of inherent existence. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is none other than form, form is also none other than emptiness. Likewise, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, like this, all phenomena are emptiness having no characteristics. They do not produce and do not cease. They have no defilement, no separation from defilement, and no decrease and no increase. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, and no consciousness. There is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mentality, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no tactile object, no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so forth, up to no mentality element, and also up to no element of mental consciousness. There is no ignorance, and no exhaustion of ignorance, and so forth, up to no aging and death, no exhaustion of aging and death. Likewise, there is no suffering, origin, cessation, or path, no exalted awareness, no attainment, also no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and abide in the perfection of wisdom. Their minds have no obstructions and no fear. Passing utterly beyond perversity, they attain the final nirvana. Also, all Buddhas reside perfectly in the three times, having relied upon the perfection of wisdom, became manifest complete Buddhas in the state of unsurpassed, perfect, complete enlightenment. Therefore, the mantra of perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the equal to the unequaled mantra, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, since it's not false, should be known as the truth. Mantra of perfection of wisdom is proclaimed, Tayatam Gata Paragata Parsam Gata so on. Shariputra, a bodhisattva, great being, should train the profound perfection of wisdom like this. Then the Blessed One arose from that concentration and said to Srivalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva, the great being, that he'd spoken well. Good, good, O son, just like that. Since it's like that, just as you have revealed, in that way the profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced, and Tathagatas will also rejoice. When the Blessed One had said this, the Venerable Shariputra, Superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva, the great being, and the entire circle of disciples, as well as worldly beings, gods, humans, demigods, and spirits, were delighted and highly praised what had been spoken by the Blessed One. Okay, so, what I'd like to talk about today really is just to draw a little bit of parallel between some of the conclusions, sort of the main themes, I guess, and conclusions, pardon me, Je Tsongkhapa comes to in his text, Essence of True Eloquence, which he considers as kind of like crowning glory text, so to speak. And the conclusions basically arrived at by the very, very famous 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. So one of the great, sort of, you could say, founders of what they call analytic, or most recently Anglo-American tradition of philosophy, which in a lot of ways is sort of the dominant tradition now in the world. this is sort of a 20th century movement. It's changed a lot. Now you could just basically call it philosophy. But if you look sort of historically at the first 50 years of the 20th century, you can sort of draw a distinction between a lot of European thought, what they would sort of, this is all kind of a bit of a cartoon way of putting it, but sort of what they call continental thought, phenomenology, existentialism, and moving into structuralism and postmodernism, and what they call analytic philosophy, which was called analytic philosophy. Great founders of famous philosophers, Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. And then in the 1950s, we had to more of an American style philosophy, in particular with the work of Willard Van Orman Quine, and then what they call the whole post-Quinean turn in philosophy. Anyway, we're not doing a philosophy class here. So the person who draws in the sort of comparison and the link between Je Tsongkhapa and Wittgenstein is, of course, Professor Robert Thurman, who's a big influence on me when I started Buddhism. He was very, very, and he still is. He's amazing, huge trailblazer and a great figure in, I guess, the Western dissemination of Tibetan Buddhism. Obviously, starting in the 1970s for him, and he's still alive now, doing work in his old age. But he's the one that his only 14th Dalai Lama had told him to translate and give it a little bit of a commentary on Essence of True Eloquence, and that it was important to do that. So that's he's sort of put that out as a Central Philosophy of Tibet. Showed you the book there. So in his introduction, he says that the best, if we need sort of a Western person, a Western philosopher or thinker, as a way of understanding Je Tsongkhapa, probably the best person to do that, to use, would be Ludwig Wittgenstein. So this isn't going to be a class on Ludwig Wittgenstein. If this does interest you, I would really, really point you in his direction. And of course, that's an enormous thinker like Aristotle, Kant, Heidegger, Hegel. Like you can spend your whole life studying Wittgenstein, and I studied him extensively, particularly 30 years ago when I was in grad school. I still read him. He is a companion in my life to this day. I still have tons of books on Wittgenstein. I still read him. I love him very much. He's been hugely influential to me in the same way that Nietzsche has been. Jill Deleuze is showing me the relationship between Nietzsche and Spinoza, for instance, huge influence on me. And a whole host of other thinkers, particularly a lot of more recent French Nietzschean thinkers. But that's another story, I guess I could say. But for me, I guess when I sort of started practicing, sorry, my asthma's acting up in case I have to keep coughing here. Basically, starting in the mid 1990s, 1995, when I started practicing Tibetan Buddhism, and I got a hold of Robert Thurman's work here and started studying it and stuff, this was hugely influential. Of course, I was still in grad school and studying with Wittgenstein, but all of a sudden, I was able to relate my scholarly work at the time and work in philosophy to the new religion I was practicing, and seeing sort of the parallels and oftentimes the complete overlaps between Je Tsongkhapa's work and Ludwig Wittgenstein's work. So I just wanted to share that if just as a way, this has sort of been my way to understand the work in the tradition, and I think it's very fruitful and amazing. So I like to just point people, if they're interested in further research. The Wittgenstein teachers I studied with at the time, Wittgenstein, there's a lot of thinkers like this, where a lot of people write on them. And at the time, even in the 1990s, there was an enormous amount of work on Wittgenstein. And what was funny is that his influence was the first part of the 20th century, first until he died in the early 1950s. But even by the 1960s and 70s, his philosophy really wasn't influential anymore in terms of what he thought philosophy should be and what it should do. His whole point was almost, in a lot of ways, an ethical, almost mystical way of understanding philosophy, in that when you understand how philosophy works, you basically let it go, in true sort of Dharma way, Dharma fashion. Whereas starting even in the 1950s, even in England with Strawson's work, and then of course going into American philosophers like Quine and Davidson and everyone else, everyone sort of jumped off Wittgenstein's boat and got back into philosophy, in particular to doing metaphysics, all the stuff that he thought was wrong-headed and false and everything else. And so by the 1970s or even early, famous Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking was talking. He wouldn't say who it was, but a famous female philosopher, English philosopher. I don't know if it was Wittgenstein's student, G.M. Amscombe, or someone else, basically said, well, it's almost like Wittgenstein had never existed any of his work. Like a sense of what he was trying to get people to see, no one's interested anymore. So where I'm going with this is that my philosophy teacher, professor, recommended only a few books on Wittgenstein, basically Ray Monk's biography, A Duty of Genius, which is such an amazing book, biography of Wittgenstein. Jaco Hinteka's and his wife's book. Jaco Hinteka was a very, very famous modal logician and expert on Husserl, an incredible analytic philosopher. And they wrote a book called Investigating Wittgenstein. Another one was called Wittgenstein's Vienna, which just gives the whole sort of cultural background to his work. And then there's several good introductions. I can think of a bunch. Even Wittgenstein's students, Norman Malcolm, the famous American philosopher, has written some good books on him. Starting when I was in grad school, you had, I think it's very important, sort of a movement, what they call the New Wittgenstein, where you had people, famous philosophers like Cora Diamond, she was teaching, she's probably retired, she might even be dead, I don't know, and James Conant, trying to sort of get at the original, almost sort of ethical turn in Wittgenstein. And their work was very, very good. And I'm trying to think of anyone else that anyway, if something else comes to me, I'll think. But you can sort of do a general look. But um, so anyway, what I'd like to look at, just very, very briefly, looking at using some of um, Robert Thurman's, um, I guess, sort of points and sort of thoughts on Wittgenstein and Tsongkhapa. I just like to just bring up a few points. And what you see in Wittgenstein really is he only published really one very, very famous, influential masterpiece in his life. His first text, his first book, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. I think it's in 1921 or something. You can look, and that's considered at the time. He said this was the full statement of his philosophy, and he even quit philosophy and became a school teacher. Um, and taught children and sort of had quit the whole thing. And then what happened is some of his friends and students had questions about the text, went to talk to him about it, and then he realized that there's all sorts of mistakes in the text. So they told him to come back to Cambridge. All in the 1930s, he was working on the problems in this text. And then he died of cancer and he never published anything else, but he left all his notes that his students were able to publish his subsequent books. And the most famous one being the Philosophical Investigations that was put out after his death. And that's considered, those are the two big bookends, like his old philosophy, the Tractatus, and his quote unquote mature, newer philosophy in the Investigations. And these are kind of like that, sort of two of the biggest influential books of philosophy in the 20th century. The Tractatus brought what they call sort of logical positivism and logical atomism. And then the later book, which is the book that's most like Je Tsongkhapa's work, is, you could say, sort of founded the whole what they call ordinary language philosophy school. And so he was very, very influential in terms of the consequences of his work. And again, I don't want this to be a class on Wittgenstein. Again, even it's been a long time since I've studied him formally. I'm not a philosophy professor; I'm just a flight attendant. And again, I just sort of tie a lot of these things together and then send you off to do your own research. But basically, if you could sort of sum up in the most cartoon way the difference between his original first philosophy and his later mature work. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein was a student of the two great thinkers that started the 20th century, two famous German philosophers that were in touch and knew each other and were colleagues but came to very different conclusions. One was Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, and the other one's called Frege, founder of analytic philosophy. And both of them were working on modern symbolic language and philosophy of mathematics. And so what happens, and there's Michael Dummett, the very famous English philosopher, spent his whole career looking at this, basically, his understanding Frege's philosophy. The question they'd ask is, how do we know what's true in the world? How do we know the truth of statements? How do we know that there's an objective world? What's true? How do we know how language works? This and that. Both of them thought that mathematics in philosophy of mathematics was the way to go, because mathematics is something that when we study it is always true, necessarily true, no matter who does it, and it's kind of eternally true. 2 plus 2 equals 4, no matter how many people say it, who says it, when it's said, where it's said, this and that. So in what Husserl said is that we'd have to find the truth of mathematics in the logical structures of consciousness. Whereas Frege says, they were disagreeing on this, said that we actually have to look at the logical structures of language itself. Then we can see, and so from that standpoint, we can build up a world. So from Frege, we have to start with language and then somehow arrive at consciousness and the world. From Husserl, we start with consciousness and then build up to language. And there's problems with both. And, this is you spend your whole life studying this. So Wittgenstein was one of Frege's students. So his whole point in the tractate is what he said is that language is about, describing or making true statements about the world. And what it has to be is that it has to be a representation of the world. The statements that we have, we enunciate, the language we use, how we talk and how we think. He says basically it's about a picture of the world, right? So there's very simple objects in the world, and that on a very basic, very, very, very subtle level, we can sort of break language up and see how different words and statements reflect, almost like in a mirror, these objects or states of affairs in the world, right? But what he said in the Tractatus is that the language and the world go together, so it's like you can't separate them. It's like a picture and the picture of the object that it's representing. So what a picture can never show is the fact that it's a picture. So something like he said, we can only show this, we can't say it or talk about it, because it's the basis of how we think and how we say things. So, a picture can't show within itself as a picture that it's picturing something or that it's a picture. And that's why in a lot of ways we know how a picture works. Like if you take a picture of something on your phone and show it, you know how that works. Like the picture of my bowl of ramen noodles or something. This is why like animals, let's say, or different life forms that don't understand what a picture is, when you show them a picture of something, they don't know what it is. They don't understand the logical connection a picture has to its object. So what's amazing about the Tractatus is Wittgenstein says is that if a picture cannot picture its picturing, and language is like a picture, language can't show itself. You can't see how language pictures the world. It just is a reflection of the world. So you can't logically see how it does that. All we can talk about is that there's, you look at the logic, and he shows us with truth tables and tautologies and so forth. You can study all books on the Tractatus. But he basically says technically we can't get outside of language and thinking to show how they match up or represent the world. You can't say that. So then he says, but if you can't say that, if I can't show how a picture pictures within the picture, I can't show how language itself thinks or says things about it within language itself. I can't take an outside perspective on language. Language is just the world. Things are just labels that way. I can't show you how they work or connect onto things. Then we can't really talk about philosophy being able to do this. But he says if that's the case, then I couldn't have written this book, because my book, The Tractatus, is precisely trying to do this. So at the very end, he says, like, if you understand this book, you see that it's nonsense, right? And then he says basically like throwing the ladder away after you get over the wall, or this example, once you get to the other side of the river, you don't need the boat anymore, right? So that's it's kind of interesting that way. So then that's why he quit philosophy and went away. Now, then when people got him to come back and they started showing problems with that, I mean, the basic thing that Bertrand Russell, his friend and mentor, said is like, well, how does that work even as a book? Like, like this is why he had become the idea of meta languages and this. He was trying in his introduction to the Tractatus to even understand how it could work as a book to even show you that point. I mean, it's almost like a Zen koan. How does this work in the first place, right? And they were fighting over that. So later on, the 1930s and 40s, Wittgenstein really went almost crazy trying to figure out the problems that he was dealing with from the Tractatus. And so he ends up putting out a whole series of reflections in the Philosophical Investigations, which is just an absolute masterpiece and really worth looking at. So Jaco Hintika in his book, and Miro Hintika's wife, they write this book together called Investigating Wittgenstein, right? It's a great book. He shows that what Wittgenstein had to do, basically, is to get rid of the idea even of an objective world, like in terms of simple objects or something that language was reflecting. And basically, he went to what they said, they went from a phenomenological conception of language into what they call physicalist or an everyday view on language, right? So rather than seeing like what Husserl was trying to do is that consciousness and objects go together, I'm creating an object and then I stick a label or language on it and build it up from there. This is sort of in a lot of ways what's in the Tractatus as well. Wittgenstein sees the problems in that. Just like Husserl ran into problems with that, you had all phenomenology running into the same problems. And then Wittgenstein basically said, well, if we're within language already, let's get rid of the idea that there is somehow a true object, true mind, um, something outside of language that we're trying to get at, and just be left with the everyday conventional use of language, what they call the physicalist use of language, and just work within that. Language is precisely connecting us to the world, one another, in our own minds. You can't get outside of it. So why try to look for an outside? You can anyway. And even what does it make sense to even posit an outside of things, right? There, where is the true object, right? Where is even the true mind looking at these things? All we're left is basically with labels and the grammar and rules around labels and language use. So Wittgenstein basically, rather than trying to get at it's like the difference between the different schools of emptiness, rather than trying to use your labels to get a truly existent object, right, outside of your mind, we're going the other way around, where we're getting rid of the idea of even looking for a true inherent object altogether. And we're just looking at sort of an everyday use of language, right? I'm trying to again. I'm not so. I hope I'm not so confusing in explaining all this. It's been a while since I studied this too. I'm getting a little bit older and jet lagged here. So let's just look at everyday language with what it can do. And so he comes in that you can look at this in the Philosophical Investigations as idea of language games, all the different sort of games and grammars and rules we use to create a world that we live in and share with other people, right? So once we get rid of that, there's some kind of inherently existing thing that we're trying to get to picture, we can just sort of let everything free float, so to speak, in terms of rules and conventions and be creative. So what Wittgenstein says is that like philosophy itself should be just therapeutic, that not just practical, but therapeutic, that we're letting things be as they are in their everyday contexts and getting rid of our attempt to find what's true outside of those everyday contexts, what's outside sort of more than these conventional uses of language games and grammars and so forth. And so it's about dissolving your confusions that come when you're trying to find something truly true in language, let's say, or in the world. So this is a lot like the difference when you go to the Madhyamika Prasangika school, right? Is rather than finding something that's truly existent, you see that your attempt to find something truly existent is the problem in the first place. So it's not the problem that you can't arrive at that truly existent thing, the object outside of your mind, or what's truly existent, like is it the mind itself? The whole setup of the problem is the problem to begin with, right? So we're dissolving problems, we're dissolving our ignorance in that way. So I just wanted to read you just a few quotes from Wittgenstein here. this is all Robert Thurman quoting from the philosophical investigations, right? So, for instance, this is Robert Thurman says, relativism or conventionalism about the empirical, which focus primarily on language, is a central component of the non-egocentrist outlook. The key to the non-egocentrist avoidance of nihilistic skepticism and absolutist mysticism. The egocentrist tends to engage in one or the other of those alternatives when his critical analysis goes further than usual and he sees through his previously accepted givens, such as self, matter, object, or sense contents, and so on, and he feels his universe crumble. And even if he ever reaches such a frontier, he perceives the non-egocentrist as courting chaos, typically accuses him of nihilism. Right, so the one that's not being attached to like a truly existent self or truly existent world. So he says Wittgenstein responds to a charge like this, that if we don't have a truly existent object or self, let's say, or matter or world, that we're just a nihilist. There's nothing means anything, everything's just free floating, there's no structure to anything at all. Wittgenstein says to this, not quote, not at all. It is not a something, but is not a nothing either. The conclusion was only that a nothing would serve just as well as a something about which nothing could be said. We have only rejected the grammar which tries to force itself on us here. The paradox disappears only if we make a radical break with the idea that language always functions in one way, which is about naming quote unquote truly existent things, right? Robert Thurman says he still goes further in response to another challenge. Where does our investigation get its importance from? Since it seems only to destroy everything interesting, that is all that is great and important, as it were all the buildings, leaving behind only bits of stone and rubble. What we are destroying is nothing but houses of cars, and we are clearing up the ground on language on which they stand. That's a great one. Okay, and then the other one here, there's just some more quotes Robert Thurman says here. Wittgenstein, he says, is most explicit about the sheer conventionality of language in the following group of statements, and there's some good quotes here. Wittgenstein says, quote, the point here is not that our sense impressions can lie, but that we understand their language. And this language, like any other, is founded on convention. Another quote, one objects, so are you saying that human agreement decides what is true and what is false? It is what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language that they use. That is not agreement in opinions, but in forms of life, the way we live together and use language. Another quote, here we hit rock bottom, that is, we come down to conventions. Another quote, when philosophers use a word, knowledge, being, object, I, proposition, name, etc., and they try and grasp the essence of that thing, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used as this way in the language game, which is its original home? In other words, in everyday life, do we use the word in these sort of fancy metaphysical, religious, or philosophical ways? And he says, what we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. So rather than being all confused with metaphysics and philosophy and religion, all this kind of heavy theorizing about how words or concepts work, how do they work? Just look at how you use them in your everyday life when you're doing things. That's their real sense, right? And you see that this is always changing, that they're just rules and conventions. And so there isn't something truly existent behind them, whether that be a truly existent self or world or object or mind or anything. Last quote here, when I talk about language, words and sentences, I must use the language of everyday or everyday life. Is this language somehow too coarse and material for what I want to say? Then how is another one to be constructed? A main source of our failure to understand is that we do not command a clear view of the use of our words. Philosophy may in no way interfere with the actual use of language. It can in the end only describe it, for it cannot give any foundation either. It leaves everything as it is. Then the famous quote from Wittgenstein, essence is expressed by grammar. What is something? How we think and we talk about it, right? Using the grammar of the language that we speak. Another quote. Grammar tells us what kind of object anything is. And then he says, theology as grammar. And finally, to ward off this is Robert Thurman, the temptation to feel disappointed with settling for conventionality of language and labels in our mind. Aware of the depth of absolutist thought patterns, Wittgenstein says, quote, the great difficulty here is not to represent the matter as if there were something we couldn't do, as if there were really an object from which I derive its description, but I were somehow unable to show it to anyone. And the best thing I can propose is that we should yield to the temptation to use this picture, but then investigate how the application of the picture goes. So, in other words, even if we accept, we don't want to, we sort of want to think that there's something more to conventionality, some kind of true inherent existence to it. If we accept that, let's see if we can make that work or apply it in our everyday lives. And what you see is that you can't, right? And so it doesn't work. And then Robert Thurman, I just lost my little yeah, he sort of quotes a comment from Chandrakirti, right, who Tsongkhapa loves so much, in a similar Wittgensteinian move, right? So, for instance, yeah, it says Chandrakirti critiques Bhava Viveka the use of the expression head of Rahu, body of a pestle. Examines the justification for employing the expression hardness is the intrinsic identity of earth as a conventionally accepted expression. Okay, so Rahu, Thurman says, is a mythological demon who is all head and no body. So a pestle and a mortar and pestle in the same way is all body and no head. So head and Rahu and body and pestle refer to the same things as do hardness and earth. So the point is, Chandrakirti says in his quote, moreover, this example is incorrect because the expressions pestle and Rahu do not exist among mundane conventions, established without analysis, and do apply to their reference body and head respectively, just like in conventional designation person. So Chandrakirti is solving that problem he's arguing with Bhava Viveka with by just looking at the everyday use of words or conventions, right? Nothing more metaphysical than that. And Je Tsongkhapa comments to this. He says, it is correct according to the conventions of social communication for a speaker to dispel the doubt of a listener with the expressions pestle and Rahu, since the latter has formed the notions of body and head from hearing the corresponding words and is wondering whose body, whose head. The speaker thus wishes to eliminate, um, to eliminate the analysis recent referential, yeah, base that can be found to anchor the conventional, which is precisely why it works as severe conventionality, free of extremes of absolute nihilism. Okay, so that's Robert Thurman. So anyway, what he's Tsongkhapa is just commenting on there on um, on Chandrakirti, he's just saying, yeah, this is the problem with this is that it's basically a question of how we use concepts in terms of conventions. That Bhava Viveka being, as we've said earlier, a Sautrantika Madhyamika philosopher, right? In other words, as we know, the Sautrantika school, lower Madhyamika school, on a conventional level, there are truly existent objects outside of our mind that we stick labels to. So it's a question of how do the conventions work to give us like a true expression, right? Hence, that with the whole point is that where you have a shared, common, inherently existing object, we can make syllogisms of. Whereas the Prasangika critique, as we've said before, is that there's nothing truly existent. There's no objective public world. There's nothing existing outside of our labels or how we label things. So it's only a question of how we talk about rules or conventionality to things or grammar, right? So Chandrakirti in that quote talking about Rahu and pestles, it's how do we talk about those words? How can we use everyday language to make sense of that example? And does it make sense or not? And that's what Tsongkhapa is saying. So finally, I just have one more quote here from Tsongkhapa here, and yeah, this is it here, which is says, finally, the philosophicals, Robert Thurman says, non-egocentric attitude towards philosophy as therapy is attested to in Wittgenstein's writings. In the following passage, quote, Wittgenstein says, for the clarity we're aiming at is indeed complete clarity, but this simply means that the philosophical problem should not, that the philosophical problem should completely disappear. The real discovery is the one that makes me capable of stopping doing philosophy when I want to. The one that gives philosophy peace, so that it is no longer tormented by questions that bring itself into question. Instead, we now demonstrate a method by examples, and a series of examples can be broken off. And the difficulties are solved, not a single problem. There is not a philosophical method, though there are indeed methods like different therapies, right? So the point is around that complete clarity where we dissolve the problem in the first place. We see that it was never a problem to begin with, that we escape our confusions because we're confused about something that isn't an issue to begin with. Right? So the problem, and just like Tsongkhapa and every Buddhist would say, is our ignorance makes us think that there's truly existing things. But once we see that they've never been there in the first place, all of our problems that arise on basically building on top of those disappear. Again, it's like an illness that we've been given a medicine and the medicine clears it up. Right? So, yeah, so Wittgenstein says again, the philosopher's treatment of a question is like the treatment of an illness. And he says, what is your aim in philosophy? To shoo the fly way out of the fly bottle. In other words, we're trapped. How do you open the door and let yourself out? Right? How we do this is by dissolving the problems or conceptual mistakes we have in the first place. So anyway, just kind of leave it at that. Like what happens, there's a whole bunch of notes here. And again, I don't want this to be, sort of a class on Wittgenstein. I just sort of want to get people sort of interested in looking at this if they want a little bit more of an interesting way of understanding Tsongkhapa's Essence of True Eloquence. So what you get in Essence of True Eloquence, of course, Tsongkhapa's probably favorite philosopher and thinker and Buddhist saint is Arya Nagarjuna. And so one of the quotes he always says from Nagarjuna is Nagarjuna has his texts in philosophy being a salute or praise of relativity, right? So Nagarjuna says, what does Dharma end up doing for you? It's the supreme bliss of the quiescence of perplexities. So the bliss of being released from your confusions or perplexities, the peace or bliss or sense of totality that comes with the rest of letting go of all those problems because they were never problems in the first place. So, just looking at my notes here. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole thing on what Robert Thurman says, Wittgenstein's private argument, which I think is too much to go into today, but it's an interesting uh, argument where he says Wittgenstein's what they call private language argument is a similar argument that you get in Bhava Viveka. So just quickly, Bhava Viveka's Svotantrika Madhyamika says that if things truly exist on a conventional level and on an ultimate level when we meditate in emptiness, they're not there, but that this allows us to have sort of a private or essential object that we stick our label to. The base of the object has to truly exist for the label to work, right? And then Chandrakirti comes along and, from a Prasangika point of view, says that we can't have this truly existent base of a label, right? It wouldn't even be able to work as the base of label because it's in a relationship to the label itself. And so there's that great quote where he's sort of like in debate with Bhava Viveka, and Bhava Viveka from the Sautrantika point of view says, well, kind of like take this object, talk about it, and then Chandrakirti says, what object? Like, what are you pointing to? There's nothing there anyway. There's just, basically just labels, right? So Wittgenstein, and there's many different ways of understanding the private language argument, but he said basically, what would it be like if we had our own private language to describe our own private objects of our mind? And he said basically this could never work because languages are based on shared rules amongst other people. That's what grammar is. It's a system of rules. So I always say, like, even as a little kid, if you're making your own code that only you know, you're nevertheless sharing it with your stuffed animal friends or like whatever. Because Wittgenstein said if you had a language just for yourself without rules, you would never know how it would work, like how you would even apply the rules of grammar for your labels to work. How would you know um, whether you're addressing the same objects or anything else if you don't have a whole system for these things to make sense? Like, for instance, system of grammar, of tenses, of rules around how we do things. Rules are for other people, so it's for other people. Then you can't have a private language, right? So in other words, the sort of private truly existing object that you're seeing, that only you sort of have, and that you're applying your labels to, wouldn't be able to work. Anyway, that's another sort of talk here. So basically, what you're left with is the idea that what we have is just conventional reality, grammar, and rules, social rules. And why that's important is, of course, is like I always say, it's creative. It's because language changes, like Heidegger says, through metaphor and the poetic expression of language as it grows. It's a living thing. So we're always creating new worlds, bringing new worlds into account. But also, it allows us, from Wittgenstein's point of view, is to get rid of all of the confusions we have where we think that there's something inherent or truly existing or metaphysical about these rules or about language use. Um, yeah. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is, yeah, Tsongkhapa, Robert Thurman says, urges us to lighten with reverence to the philosophy of enlightenment, yet we see hermeneutical act of listening commonly to be formed by means of pure reason. Definitive teaching turns out to ultimately be sheer silence, the absolute negation of ultimate expressibility of reality. Yet never mistake this for the silence of this is, of course, Robert Thurman writing, non-imposition of authoritarian dogma about absolute, or pretentious or referential silence that joins non-relational mysticism, reification, naively realistic use of language to affirm the essences or their substances. So, yeah. So, what is for this inspiration, we should have reverence and listen to unimpeded eloquence that is ultimately never apart from ultimate silence. Really listen without greed of finding escape from ourselves, and join knowledge that listening is part of the transformative path. So, what's interesting is Robert Thurman saying is that this is a lot like in what they call the new interpretation of Wittgenstein, the more Fregean understanding of Wittgenstein, from the philosophers Cora Diamond, she was amazing, and James Conant, whereas they said, some people say, Wittgenstein saying that because we can't get out of language, what's most important is what is outside of language that we can't talk about, some kind of mystical reality or God or ethics or something. We can't reach it, but just on an intuitive level and on a mystical level, we can talk about. What they said is there's no outside, like basically there's a line that we can't go across. There's a limit of our grammar. And so what we always do is we never trespass that limit, because we get into a realm of nonsensicalness. Like we can't talk or even show what that other world is, that metaphysical world. So the point isn't to try and get there and to talk about it, but to not go in the first place because it's not there. So that's kind of like the emptiness as a non-affirming negative. So what they say is what's important, Wittgenstein says, is to drop below the line in a Zen way to the beauty of the everyday, the beauty of language, the beauty of conventions, the beauty of eloquence, what we create, we can express, what we can share with one another, the beauty of our everyday lives. Not trying to find something outside of our life that's even more beautiful or more special or more true, but to focus on what's right in front of us in our everyday lives, in the conventionality of our everyday lives, right? So this is what Robert Thurman's saying, is that Tsongkhapa gets it, hence the essence of true eloquence. What's the true eloquence? It's the silence of the non-affirming nature of emptiness, that this allows us to have the eloquence of our use of language and thought and labels, right? So silence and eloquence go together. So it's truly, truly poetic. So it's also about listening to the silence, listening even to language, listen to how we use grammar, listens to our metaphors, listen to how we create the toolbox of our language to create ourselves, but also the silence that makes it possible, right? So this is where we get right into these famous poets like Rilke, even some of Stephen George's stuff, any of the great sort of poets, Holderlin, these great sort of romantic poets that stress the silence and empty spaces within ourselves, as well as the idea, like Heidegger says, that language is the house of being. That language, we're sort of like Heidegger says, the shepherd of being. That what being is manifests through our words, how we express ourselves, through our poetry, through our metaphors, through our images, through our art. Now, why is this important? Like I've said before, Essence of True Eloquence, by giving this toolbox, gives us the basis to do Tantra. Tantra shows that everything is manifestation out of space, right? Everything is energy out of space. And how is this energy? It's through the power of mantra, the power of being able to express or manifest reality, right? And the bliss and peace that comes from that, and the joy that comes from that, seeing everything as a poem, everything as pure, pristine, and divine. Um, Again, I should have had a Rilke poem to read to you right now to sort of show this. But anyway, think about that. Think about that. In like what sort of in the title, Essence of True Eloquence. Think about that, the importance of silence, of listening, and eloquence. How does that really become a tantric reality of pure view with a clear appearance and divine pride and pure perception, right? The beauty of the everyday, the beauty of life, sort of the divine, holy nature of everything that exists, as William Blake would say. Okay, that's enough. Thank you so much. I got to get back to work here, and we'll see you next time with some new classes.